Hi, I'm Andrew Porter. I teach middle grade social studies in Iredell County. And my topic, as I move my giant head here, is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So, as far as the definition goes, it gets a little dicey and complicated, and it's kind of hard to boil it down to one singular definition. But this is what I have. And the idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, I have the desire to learn, grow, and create in order to better oneself, will fall under our intrinsic definition, versus the effort and work of moving forward for the purpose of a reward will be our working extrinsic motivation. Now, it's important to clarify that I use the verbs learn, grow, and create with intrinsic because generally those that are seeking to grow, to learn, and to create are doing it for personal motivation factors. This isn't always true, but a majority of the time, those verbs are associated with those individuals and those sorts of motivation factors. Whereas when you put in excessive effort and a lot of work into something, you're generally doing it for a reward of some sort. And a reward doesn't have to be necessarily tangible. It could be as simple as simply trying to get a good pat on the back or a good for you, kid, you did it. And as silly as that might sound, those very simple extrinsic rewards are things that some students just don't get at home, so they try really hard to do. Now, this isn't to say that one is more positive or more negative than the other, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Some of the sources I decided to stick with, I have a video by our people Sprouts that's on YouTube, and it really describes extrinsic and intrinsic motivation in a very simple way, utilizing pretty simple illustrations, but it describes it from early childhood through adulthood. So it doesn't just stop with public education. It still goes into the struggles of what happens when you leave high school as a young adult and what those ramifications will be if there's only one or the other types used. And that brings me to the second point, where this article on JSTOR, even though it's 20 years old at this point, really focuses on how we can use extrinsic rewards to help influence intrinsic motivation. And that's going to be a takeaway that I'll review as well from this. However, you start to see that they aren't mutually exclusive. You tend to need both. And that's going to be a very important aspect when it comes down to this. And that you then end up with Beth Hennessy's TED Talk of cultivating intrinsic motivation and creativity in the classroom. And her big emphasis was that she feels as though, as public educators specifically, when we have this drive for high test scores and we want a high passing rate and trying to keep parents and administration off our back, it's a lot easier to use extrinsic rewards and bribes than it is to help develop internal passions for our students. And so her TED Talk was very much on how to correct that pattern of behavior. Checking the time. And so this is my fourth source that I decided to use as a graphic, because this tends to be what a lot of people think of in a very simple way, that on your intrinsic side, you just want the enjoyment and interest of something, that because you enjoy it and it gives you purpose, you can grow from it, you're curious about it, it's your passion, self-expression, and it's fun, and yay, go team. Whereas your blue side, well, promotions, pay raises, benefits, bonuses, prizes, winning, you get perks. It still seems very negative. So this is an easy way to look at it that's a good starting point, but it is by no means a conclusive definition or example when it comes to education. Rather, this graphic is very much more in line with it. And the reason why I like this graphic more is that it doesn't take away from the fact that there is a stark difference between intrinsic motivators and extrinsic motivators, but it recognizes that both your self-sufficient and your dependent learner can fall on both ends of the spectrum. That you can have an extrinsically motivated learner that's valedictorian and is great at learning on their own, but has no intrinsic motivation, Well, simultaneously, you can have a very intrinsically motivated individual that just doesn't learn well, that is very dependent on their surroundings to be a good student, or what we classify to be a good student. And so this graphic really encompasses the idea that your students are on a spectrum. And so the idea of how intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation works is also on a spectrum. And that brings me to the takeaways from this is that, first of all, it shouldn't be defined as one versus the other. That it's important to understand the differences, but there's a balance of both that's needed. An intrinsic motivation and an intrinsic lifestyle teaches a student the joys of their own creation. They find what they love and what to do, whereas that intrinsic motivation can help teach right from wrong and put a structure in place that allows them to grow in a healthy fashion. With that being said, your factors can fluctuate from one side or the other. That the living factors and the definition of what's intrinsic and extrinsic could change based off the interpretation and individuality of the student. Meanwhile, it's also important to recognize that, again, your extrinsic motivation could lead to intrinsic motivation. It's the famous grandma saying, you don't know unless you try it. Well, sometimes you need to use extrinsic rewards to push students so that way they can find an intrinsic desire and growth to do something. And that leads to this question. This question is based on the idea that the mindset influences reality. The mindset of the educator has an impact on the student. And oftentimes educators might get caught up in wanting students to be completely free thinkers or just need to get those rewards in place so that educator looks well. And when you just use one, you limit your students' chances of success. When you use both, you put them up on a higher plane for them to work with. And so the question that really needs to be brought to mind is, when it comes to us as educators and using extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, we need to ask the question of, will our students succeed because of me or in spite of me? And that's a really bold question, and it's one that I hope you take to heart. Thank you for watching this. I know it's a little bit over, and I apologize, but I appreciate the time you put into it.